For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. I'm standing up on top of Tullyhog Fort, as I'm sure you've been here and you know it well. As I'm sure you know, this is the place where traditionally the lords or the kings or the chiefs of the O'Neill family were inaugurated or crowned as the next chief. The last time that happened was in 1595, 425 years ago, when Hugh O'Neill became head of the O'Neill family. He was known as Hugh the Great O'Neill. But after 9 years of war against the English and a few years of peace, Hugh O'Neill left Ireland in September 1607 in what is now called the Flight of the Earls. No new O'Neill Lord has been inaugurated here since 1595. Well, over these next few evenings and this Sunday, we're going to look at some verses that the prophet Isaiah wrote. They describe a time of darkness and gloom for the people of Israel. Isaiah was writing about 150 years before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC. After the destruction of Jerusalem, there would never be a king from David's family who would rule in Jerusalem, the earthly Jerusalem again. But through the prophet Isaiah, God warned his people of what was coming. He told them that judgment for their sin and their persistent idolatry was coming. But Isaiah also saw far beyond the destruction of Jerusalem. Isaiah saw the coming of Jesus, the King, and he saw to the very end of this world, to the time when King Jesus will come back again and will make all things new and will rule on a throne on this earth. So over these next 4 evenings, we're going to think about 4 different carols and 4 names that Isaiah gives to the coming king in chapter 9 of his prophecy. The first name is Wonderful Counselor, and the first carol is Joy to the World.
Joy to the world, the Lord has come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing, and heaven and nature sing, and heaven and nature sing. Joy to the earth, the Saviour reigns, your sweet songs implore. While fields and streams and hills and plains repeat the sounding joy, repeat the sounding joy, repeat the sounding joy. The glories of his righteousness, the wonders of his love, the wonders of his love, the wonders of his love.
The kings in Israel and Judah, like all kings, were supposed to rule, lead, and protect the people of Israel. And because they were God's kings over God's people, they were supposed to encourage and lead the people in obeying God and God's laws. But many of the kings ignored God's law, and many of them worshipped false gods, the idols and the statues of the nations around Israel. And when the king did that, well then, most of the other people in Israel thought it was okay to do that as well. But the Bible tells us, this is from Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7, the Bible tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So these kings were fools to ignore God and his law, and they brought destruction upon themselves. It was their foolishness that eventually led to the destruction of Jerusalem. But the coming king, well, he will be called Wonderful Counselor. That word wonderful is nearly always used only to describe what God has done in the Old Testament. This king will have the wonderful wisdom of God. This king will counsel and govern with the wonderful wisdom of God. It is just as we have sung in Joy to the World. He rules the world with truth and grace and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness. Never was there and never will there be a more wise, a more wonderful counselor than King Jesus.